The grand chamber of the Krill hegemony's citadel hung suspended in a perpetual twilight, a colossal concave structure where the polished obsidian floor mirrored the dizzying, star-pocked ceiling, designed to evoke the cold, impartial majesty of the void itself, a fitting backdrop for the agonizing political calculus currently under debate. Supreme Inquisitor Zarkin, whose chitinous carapace bore the subtle etchings of millennia of state service, and whose three ocular stalks typically conveyed only the deepest, coldest certainty, felt a disconcerting tremor of uncertainty in his primary mandibles as he absorbed the holographic projection shimmering at the chamber's center, a crude, uncatalogued stellar nursery designated Sol, a truly unremarkable yellow dwarf system orbiting the galactic arm's periphery. Yet now, it was the focal point of the hegemony's collective fear, a fear that contradicted the very foundation of Krill military supremacy. The projected data stream flickered with the unsettling, amateurish energy signatures of the Terran species, a newly designated Tier 2 civilization whose technological development curve was not just rapid, but utterly nonsensical, characterized by inexplicable leaps and terrifying, almost childish, inconsistencies that defied the predictable, logical progression cycles documented across 300 generations of monitored species evolution. High Chancellor Threll, whose diplomatic corps had spent cycles attempting to establish a stable, codified communication matrix with the Terran governance structure, articulated the deep-seated confusion that permeated the debate, his voice a low, resonant thrumming that barely disturbed the chamber's weighty silence, stating that the fundamental issue lay not in the Terrans' limited orbital defense capability, which was demonstrably minimal and antiquated, but in the unsettling and frustrating ambiguity of their intent, an ambiguity that seemed less a product of cunning strategy and more an inherent, chaotic property of their collective consciousness, a frightening lack of predictable ethical or logical frameworks that made threat assessment an exercise in pure philosophical speculation. The recent incident, a truly minor transgression involving a Terran scout vessel straying perilously close to the meticulously guarded Krill resource harvesting station on the frontier of the Ophiuchus sector, had escalated not because of the physical proximity, but because of the Terran response to the subsequent, perfectly reasonable Krill ultimatum. A profound, almost mocking silence of several terrestrial hours, followed by a single, encrypted transmission of bewildering complexity. This transmission, after exhaustive analysis by the hegemony's best cryptographers and xenolinguists, contained only a sparse handful of intelligible phrases, the most prominent and infuriatingly cryptic of which were the non-sequitur declarations. Warning! Decommissioned prototype active, and the seemingly irrelevant phrase, "We apologize for the inconvenience this inevitable display will cause." Fleet Marshal Vorlag, commander of the hegemony's 9th Permanent Pacification Armada, and a creature whose life had been dedicated to the absolute, unwavering efficacy of overwhelming kinetic and energy-based force application, slammed a ceremonial appendage onto the polished podium with a brittle crack that echoed through the vast space, expressing a frustration that bordered on intellectual outrage at the protracted philosophical hand-wringing over a species that, by all measurable metrics of galactic power, barely warranted the deployment of a single cruiser, much less the consideration of the Grand Council. Vorlag dismissed the prototype transmission as a pathetic, transparent psychological ploy, a final, desperate bluff from a species that understood, perhaps subconsciously, the inescapable trajectory of conflict with a superior power, arguing with an unnerving confidence that the Terrans had proven themselves inherently unstable, their internal histories a testament to recurrent, self-inflicted violence, and that to permit such unpredictable volatility to remain unchecked on the galactic frontier was not merely a strategic oversight, but a profound failure of the hegemony's core mandate, to preserve the cosmic order through the judicious and timely application of necessary force. He advocated for the immediate and absolute dissolution of the Terran defense infrastructure, a surgical, non-destructive engagement designed solely to cripple their orbital capacity, seize their limited-range communication technology for detailed analysis, and establish a permanent Krill protectorate, thereby placing the chaotic Terran development under the stabilizing, logical stewardship of the hegemony. Zarkin, however, could not dismiss the unnerving pattern of anomalies. The very structure of the Terran transmission was mathematically clean, lacking the fuzzy redundancy characteristic of a hasty bluff, and the theoretical physics models embedded within the encryption were disturbingly advanced, far exceeding the capability implied by their known energy weapon outputs or their crude, propellant-based interstellar drive systems, suggesting a segregated, compartmentalized development stream that the hegemony was failing to account for, a terrifying, concealed depth beneath the superficial simplicity. He watched the projections of the Ninth Armada's planned trajectory, an immense, glorious wave of thousands of vessels, destroyers, battleships, dreadnoughts, a display of conventional power so vast it could shatter a moon, and a cold certainty began to settle in his primary consciousness. If the Terrans were truly capable of nothing more than petty bluster, Vorlag's plan was redundant and wasteful. If, however, their ignored prototype was anything more than a fabrication, the consequence of such an overwhelming conventional deployment would not merely be a military setback, but a philosophical one, a crisis of faith in the hegemony's core belief system that true power was always visible, quantifiable, and bound by the known laws of the cosmos. The internal political currents of the Krill hegemony were complex, an ancient, delicately balanced system where the militant fervor of the fleet marshals was perpetually counterbalanced by the cautious, long-view diplomacy of the chancellors, all overseen by the unblinking, data-driven scrutiny of the inquisitorial corps, and the Terran situation threatened to destabilize this entire equilibrium. Vorlag's faction, emboldened by centuries of unchallenged dominance and the hegemony's inherent belief in the linear superiority of its ancient technologies, demanded the satisfaction of the ultimatum, arguing that any delay or further diplomatic outreach would be perceived as weakness, a fatal political and military error that could inspire similar insubordination in the countless client species across the galactic quadrant. Threll advocating for a smaller exploratory deployment, a demonstration of force, not an annihilation, was systematically being outvoted by the sheer weight of historical precedent and military pride. Zarkin realized that the debate was no longer about the Terrans. It was about the Krill, about the psychological comfort derived from maintaining the illusion of absolute, comprehensive knowledge of the universe, and the terrifying prospect that a small, disorganized, self-destructive species might possess a singular, incomprehensible advantage that defied the very axioms of their established galactic order. Days bled into cycles, and the debate remained mired in a paralyzing blend of arrogance and systemic denial, while the Ninth Armada continued its inexorable, majestic advance toward the Terran system, its vast energy signature a blinding beacon of conventional might against the black canvas of space, broadcasting its intent to impose order with every subtle shift of its formation. Vorlag, now speaking with the voice of the entire fleet command, delivered a lengthy, impassioned address detailing the strategic necessity of the upcoming engagement, a philosophical treatise on the responsibility of the strong to guide the young, arguing that the Terrans, trapped by their own history of internal conflict, required an external, decisive intervention to prevent their eventual, predictable collapse, an intervention that was, paradoxically, an act of mercy dressed in the armor of war. He detailed the non-lethal components of the attack plan: targeted electromagnetic pulse weaponry aimed at orbital communication arrays, precise kinetic strikes against known shipyards, and the deployment of psychological warfare matrices designed to instill a profound respect for Krill authority. A plan so meticulously designed it accounted for every possible known Terran countermeasure. A plan that fundamentally refused to acknowledge the existence of the unknown quantity the diplomatic corps had tried, and failed, to define. Zarkin spent the final moments before the engagement sequestered in the chamber's silent, subterranean analysis core, reviewing the single, anomalous piece of sensor data recovered from the Terran perimeter scout that had precipitated the crisis. A fleeting, low-level distortion in the localized spacetime matrix, a signature so weak it had been dismissed as an instrumentation error, a ghost reading from a system not rated for that kind of theoretical energy fluctuation. Yet its structure suggested a gravitational effect without the presence of a corresponding, measurable mass, a physics violation that should be impossible. He felt a deep, chilling sense of dread, not the fear of defeat, but the fear of incomprehension, the terrifying realization that the hegemony, in its long, unchallenged rule, might have ceased to learn, relying instead on the ossified dogma of past victories, making them philosophically brittle in the face of true, chaotic innovation. He ordered the deep space sentinel probes, designed to passively monitor the battle's periphery, to prioritize the spectral analysis of any non-conventional energy signatures, an instruction he knew Vorlag would have dismissed as superstition, but which Zarkin considered the only rational response to the Terran's maddening unpredictability. The Krill Armada arrived at the designated line of engagement, an insurmountable wave of steel and blinding energy, arrayed in the classic, overwhelming Hammer of Judgment formation, a symbol of Krill power recognized and feared across the entire spiral arm. The meager Terran orbital defenses, a handful of satellite platforms, and a small cluster of older-model, missile-based defensive frigates, looked like specks of dust preparing to meet a gravitational singularity. The initial, standard ultimatum transmission was broadcast on all known Terran frequencies, a cold, synthesized voice delivering the non-negotiable terms of surrender and submission to hegemony authority, demanding the immediate deactivation of all military assets and the disclosure of all advanced technology. The silence that followed was not the frantic, broken static of a fearful, overwhelmed species, but a calm, protracted, and profoundly unnerving void that lasted precisely 12 standard Krill minutes. Then the Terran response arrived, not as a panicked plea or a desperate counter-ultimatum, but as a low, smooth, almost apologetic voice, synthesized to a frequency that resonated with an unsettling calmness throughout the vast Krill command bridge. This message is transmitted by the Provisional Stellar Defense Command of Earth. We acknowledge receipt of your ultimatum. We regret that compliance is not possible. For clarity, and as previously warned, the asset designated Prototype Etheria, sub-designation Ignorance of Scale, is now fully active. We apologize deeply for the inconvenience and for the necessary, immediate cessation of further diplomatic exchanges. You have fundamentally underestimated the nature of the lesson about to be delivered. The transmission ended as cleanly as it began, leaving a vacuum of comprehension in the Krill command centers, the phrase ignorance of scale echoing with a cryptic, chilling finality. Fleet Marshal Vorlag, standing rigid on the primary command battleship, a creature of cold, unwavering procedure, felt a momentary surge of contemptuous rage at the sheer audacity of the Terran communication, dismissing it in a sharp, clipped command to his bridge staff. Execute Phase 1. Initiate the disabling cascade. Target the orbital communication grid. Ignore the theatrical chatter. This species requires a firm, decisive hand. The Armada surged forward, a brilliant, terrifying confluence of kinetic fire and focused energy beams arcing across the void, an irreversible statement of galactic dominance, precisely calculated to disable the entire Terran defensive perimeter in a single, perfectly coordinated strike, a conventional engagement that had been perfected over countless subjugations. It was at that exact, microsecond of peak energy expenditure that the anomalous data signature, previously flagged by Zarkin's preemptive order, erupted from the Terran system center. It did not register as a weapon discharge, or an energy blast, or a kinetic event. Instead, the Krill sensor arrays, tuned for the violence of conventional warfare, recorded a subtle, deep space shimmer, a momentary, complex violation of the established laws of physics localized around the single, non-standard Terran vessel. The Krill intelligence had previously dismissed as an obsolete, non-threatening cargo transport loitering at the fringe of the defense perimeter. This vessel, the Prototype Etheria, was now the absolute epicenter of the event, yet it emitted no heat, no discernible weapon signature, and maintained a profound, silent immobility. The effects of the Etheria's activation were not seen, but instantly felt by every sensor system across the entire Armada. The thousands of Krill vessels, engines thrumming with the collective energy of the attack, simply ceased to function. It was not an explosion, nor a detonation, but a profound, instantaneous systemic collapse. The intricate, millennia-developed energy matrices that powered the ships, their shields, their weapons, their gravitational stabilizers, were not overloaded or destroyed. They were, in a terrifying display of surgical precision, instantaneously and absolutely disassembled at the subatomic level. The vessels, rendered inert in a fraction of a heartbeat, became non-reactive masses, their internal energy pools simply ceasing to exist as a coherent force. The Armada, the glorious, unstoppable hammer of judgment, vanished from the conflict not in a blaze of glory, but in a profound, unsettling silence, the thousands of massive vessels instantly becoming cold, dark, and utterly harmless derelicts floating lee. Fellously in the void, a testament not to destructive power, but to the incomprehensible ability to negate power entirely. The engagement was over, not in minutes, but in a single, impossible, silent moment. In the Grand Chamber, the holographic projection of the Sol system, which had been tracking the Armada's progress, flickered once. The immense visual representation of Krill might dissolving into a cloud of non-data, replaced by the solitary, inert icon of the Terran prototype. A profound, shattering silence descended upon the Krill Council, a silence heavier than any political tension, filled only with the faint, rhythmic clack of Zarkin's observational appendages against the console. Fleet Marshal Vorlag, whose projected image had been observing the battle from the flagship, was simply gone, replaced by a residual static that held the spectral impression of pure, instantaneous systemic failure. The political debate, the arrogance, the procedural certainty of the hegemony, all evaporated under the impossible, terrifying weight of that singular, incomprehensible action. The sheer, terrifying scale of the Terran countermeasure defied every known law of conventional warfare, presenting a species that had developed not a weapon, but a fundamental tool of deterrence so absolute it rendered conventional conflict an archaic, philosophical irrelevance. Zarkin, his uncertainty now solidified into a cold, terrifying comprehension, was the first to break the silence, his voice devoid of the calculated political gravity he usually employed. Now a simple, raw command that cut through the chamber's paralyzed shock. Cease all further military posturing. Send an immediate, non-encoded, non-threatening diplomatic transmission to the Terran Provisional Stellar Defense Command. State only, we seek immediate, unescorted, and unconditional dialogue regarding the principles of localized energy negation. Prepare the Observer, a single vessel, stripped of all offensive capability, crewed only by first contact specialists and non-military personnel. I will personally lead the mission. The hegemony requires not a military solution, but a profound, philosophical re-education. We must understand the why of this destruction, for the how is already terrifyingly clear. His decision was not debated. The fear of the Terran prototype was now an absolute, unchallengeable political reality, a horrifying, palpable demonstration of power that transcended the realm of conflict and entered the terrifying domain of cosmic-level control. The journey of the Observer toward the Terran homeworld was conducted in a state of enforced, psychological silence, the Krill crew grappling with the existential terror of having encountered a force that could effortlessly nullify the combined military might of their civilization, a power that possessed the chilling grace of absolute control. As the Observer entered the Terran gravitational well, the visual confirmation of the homeworld, Earth, was profoundly anticlimactic. A vibrant, blue-green sphere, teeming with the energy signatures of a complex, thriving civilization, yet displaying none of the overt, massive militarization one would expect from a species capable of such cosmic violence. Their orbital defenses remained minimal, almost symbolic, suggesting an almost dismissive lack of concern for external threats, a terrifying confidence rooted in the knowledge that their ignored prototype was the only defense they needed, a shield forged from the terrifying knowledge of absolute power. The Terran diplomatic response was equally non-threatening, a simple, nondescript vessel materializing alongside the Observer, a design that emphasized pure function and speed over any display of force or aesthetic intimidation. From it emerged Ambassador Kale, the primary Terran delegate, whose physical presence, a figure of moderate height, wearing simple, unadorned diplomatic attire, was utterly devoid of the cultural signaling of authority or threat, a profound contrast to the elaborate regalia and psychological posturing inherent in Krill high diplomacy. The meeting was held aboard the Observer, Zarkin insisting on hosting the initial contact to convey the gravity of the Krill submission. The atmosphere in the meeting chamber was not one of negotiation, but of a profound, anxious silence. The Krill delegation, still reeling from the systemic shock, observing the Terran diplomat with a mixture of terrified respect and intellectual desperation. Ambassador Kale began the dialogue not with demands or justifications, but with a simple, unnerving statement that addressed the core of the Krill misunderstanding. Supreme Inquisitor Zarkin, we are deeply sorry for the loss of your vessels and personnel. It was a regrettable, though mathematically necessary, act of self-preservation. You came to impose a lesson through the calculus of overwhelming force. We simply demonstrated the fallacy inherent in that calculus. The prototype Etheria was not a warship in the conventional sense. It was a philosophical statement, a device of ultimate, irreversible deterrence, built specifically to be ignored by every logical metric of military capability until the exact moment it was needed, hence its internal designation. Cale's voice was calm, measured, and carried an unnerving quality of absolute, unwavering logic, devoid of emotional projection or the customary diplomatic obfuscation that characterized galactic relations. Zarkin, setting aside the pre-prepared diplomatic script that now seemed utterly irrelevant, addressed the core mystery with raw, unvarnished directness. The technology employed by the Etheria defies our understanding of energy mechanics. It did not destroy the Armada, it negated it. Explain the principle, Ambassador. The hegemony requires knowledge, not retribution. Cale paused, observing the alien inquisitor with an expression of profound, quiet seriousness, before launching into a dense, astonishing explanation of Terran theoretical physics, describing the Etheria's primary function not as a weapon that generates energy, but as a mechanism that introduces a localized, self-correcting temporal distortion into the target's energy matrix, forcing a near-instantaneous, phase-shift cancellation of all coherent energy states. The vessels did not explode. Their fundamental forces simply reached equilibrium and ceased to maintain the structured state required for mechanical function, a process the Terrans termed systemic entropy enforcement. The deep world-building of the Terran species began to unfold not through historical data, but through Cale's philosophical framework. He explained that humanity's chaotic, violent past had led to a profound, collective realization that technological advancement, when coupled with volatile ethical instability, led only to guaranteed self-annihilation. The Etheria was the result of a global, high-level, clandestine agreement to build one weapon so terrifyingly effective, so utterly violative of all conventional conflict standards, that its mere existence, once demonstrated, would render all subsequent warfare impossible and unthinkable. The prototype was ignored, Cale explained, his voice low and serious, because we wanted it to be ignored. It represented a technological path we collectively deemed too dangerous for mass production, too corrosive to the ethical stability required for a harmonious society. It was designed to sit idle, to become the forgotten, discarded possibility of war, until a moment arrived, as it just did, when a larger, more powerful entity chose to impose violence upon us. The Etheria's single, non-repeatable demonstration was the ultimate statement. We possess the capacity for absolute surgical power, but our choice is to contain it, to keep it decommissioned. Your Armada forced us to violate that principle, which is why we apologized. It was not a victory for us. It was a profound failure of galactic diplomacy. This reveal, the Terran choice to decommission their most powerful technology, struck the Krill delegation with a force greater than any military assault. The Krill hegemony's entire political, military, and social structure was predicated on the continuous, relentless pursuit of maximal, demonstrable power. To build the absolute ultimate weapon, and then, by ethical choice, to mothball it and base their entire defense strategy on the deterrence offered by a single, terrifying demonstration, was a concept so alien to Krill logic it bordered on the divine. It represented a profound, hidden depth, a species that, through the crucible of self-inflicted near-extinction, had developed not just advanced technology, but a hyper-advanced ethical philosophy that dictated the limits of power. Zarkin realized that the humans were not underestimated. They were simply misunderstood because they were playing a game entirely outside the hegemony's cosmological paradigm. Their true power was not the Etheria, but the restraint that kept it silent. The subsequent cycles of dialogue between the Krill and the Terrans initially centered on the technical analysis of the systemic entropy enforcement, slowly and irrevocably shifted into a deep, philosophical exchange on the nature of civilization, conflict, and the definition of true stability. Cale detailed the Terran concept of measured escalation, a diplomatic doctrine where the first line of defense was always absolute transparency and logical argument, reserving the ignored prototype as the final, absolute failsafe against an entity intent on total, unreasoning domination. The Krill, humbled and stripped of their military pride, found themselves confronting their own systemic flaws, an over-reliance on the visible manifestation of power, a lack of psychological flexibility, and a deep-seated arrogance that had blinded them to the possibility of nonlinear technological and ethical evolution. The Relationship began to coalesce not around a treaty of coercion, but around a mutual, profound respect. The Krill respecting the Terran power and the terrifying self-control that contained it, and the Terrans respecting the Krill's capacity for immediate, systemic intellectual change in the face of undeniable truth. Zarkin, now an unofficial envoy to the Terran system, spent countless hours with Kale, exploring the vast, rich tapestry of Terran culture, finding a chaotic beauty in their arts and philosophies that contrasted sharply with the Krill's rigid, militaristic aesthetic. The humans, it turned out, were deeply passionate, but had learned to channel that passion into creation and exploration, viewing conflict as an unnecessary, tragic distraction from the pursuit of knowledge. The alliance was formalized not in the grand, intimidating chamber of the Krill Citadel, but in a quiet, simple, glass-domed observatory overlooking the serene blue oceans of Earth, a deliberate cultural exchange emphasizing peace over power. The terms were simple: mutual non-aggression, immediate technology and cultural exchange programs, and the establishment of a joint strategic cosmic observation initiative. The hegemony, in a move that shook the entire quadrant, officially dismantled the core tenets of the Pacification Corps and shifted massive resources into xenolinguistics, theoretical physics, and cultural studies, acknowledging, in a profound institutional statement, that the Terran encounter had fundamentally changed the direction of their civilization. It was during the initial joint technology exchange, a seemingly mundane transfer of propulsion and life support schematics, that the final, colossal twist began to unfold, an event that rendered the entire conflict, the Etheria's destructive demonstration, and the subsequent alliance merely a prelude to a far greater cosmic narrative. Ambassador Kale, while presenting the operational details of the Etheria's complex, compartmentalized propulsion system, casually remarked that the engine's temporal distortion capabilities, which enabled the silent, instantaneous relocation in combat, were in fact a refined, stable iteration of a theoretical warp-stress accumulator they had initially designed for deep space cartography. Zarkin, observing the schematics with intense focus, noted a peculiar anomaly. The drive's operational sensor residue included an inexplicable, faint, repeating spectral signature that appeared to be a constant byproduct of the Etheria's core function, a signature the Terrans seemed to have quarantined and ignored as background noise. Kale, observing Zarkin's intense scrutiny of the anomaly, hesitated, then brought up a separate, highly classified projection. "Inquisitor," he began, his voice now lower, carrying an entirely new layer of gravity, "the Etheria was indeed an ignored prototype. Ignored not just because its weapon potential was deemed too great, but because its core theoretical physics opened a doorway we were not ready to step through. While we focused on containing the potential for local conflict, the prototype's engine, operating in its unique high-distortion mode, inadvertently functioned as the most powerful passive listening array ever constructed. The temporal stress accumulation, that byproduct you noticed, creates a unique resonance signature that propagates across immense, intergalactic distances." The holographic projection expanded, moving beyond the familiar cluster of their galactic arm and into the deep, dark void between the galaxies. The small, repeating spectral signature Zarkin had observed was, when amplified by the Terran computing network, revealed to be a structured, incredibly complex signal, a patterned stream of electromagnetic radiation that had traveled across millions of light years, originating from the absolute edge of the observable cosmic field. Kale explained that the signal was not an aggressive broadcast, nor a plea for help, but an organized, mathematically perfect transmission that suggested an origin civilization of truly incomprehensible scale and longevity. "The signal," Kale continued, letting the weight of the realization hang in the silence, "was a map, a mathematically precise navigational data stream leading to a singular point in the intergalactic void." The projection zoomed onto the signal's terminus, revealing not a planet or a star system, but an enormous, geometrically perfect construct, an object of such impossible scale and precise, manufactured symmetry that it defied the Terrans' entire understanding of engineering and material science. It was a massive, rotating structure, an abandoned megastructure of truly cosmic dimensions, a silent sentinel placed millions of years ago, radiating a gentle, patterned energy signature that had remained constant since the Terrans first detected it cycles ago. It was not a weapon, nor a defense platform, but a silent, beautiful, colossal artifact. A perfect, non-threatening cosmic monument. The Terrans had a choice, Kale concluded, his eyes fixed on the incomprehensible, beautiful megastructure. Do we focus all our resources on fighting a predictable local war with a superior power like the hegemony, or do we create a failsafe, the Etheria, to quickly and absolutely deter that local threat and focus the true ambition of our civilization on the silent, infinite unknown that this signal represents? We chose the latter. The Etheria was an absolute necessity for local peace, but it was always merely the key to the greater cosmic doorway. The entire conflict with your Armada was, to us, a profound, tragic, but entirely necessary distraction from this. Zarkin, standing beside the human diplomat, stared at the projection of the silent, perfect megastructure, a structure that dwarfed their understanding of the universe. Realizing that the entire Krill hegemony, with its thousands of years of galactic dominance and its colossal armadas, had been operating on a local scale that was, in the vastness of the cosmos, tragically provincial. The Terrans, through their short, chaotic history, had developed the one thing the Krill had lost, the capacity to look past the immediate threat, past the local conflict, and towards the terrifying, beautiful frontier of the truly unknown. The ignored prototype had indeed destroyed an armada, but its true purpose was not the display of power, but the preservation of opportunity, the opportunity to engage with a mystery that made the fate of their local arm of the galaxy seem small and contained. A profound, melancholic awe settled over Zarkin, a realization that the terrifying power of humanity lay not in their capacity to destroy, but in their capacity to dream past the destruction, to weaponize their own ethical restraint, and to utilize a necessary, terrible conflict as merely a momentary distraction from the exploration of the infinite. The fear of humanity was finally replaced by a terrifying, profound respect, a realization that the Terrans were not a species defined by their power, but by the magnitude of the cosmic frontier they had chosen to pursue. The alliance was no longer a political necessity, but a philosophical imperative, the union of ancient power and terrifying, ethical innovation, necessary to approach the silent, magnificent invitation that now beckoned from the far reaches of the intergalactic void. A doorway opened by the silent hum of Earth's ignored, prototype warship. The story of their local conflicts was over. The terrifying, unified story of their cosmic journey had just begun, a journey towards the ultimate, silent, and ancient perfection that awaited them in the deep, beckoning dark.